Good morning. My name is Pastor Scott Kirkhoff. I am the pastor of Faith Lutheran Church in Kent, Ohio. We're still under the COVID-19 quarantine, and I've been posting sermons on Facebook and YouTube, but I've had several members in the congregation have said, what about a Bible class? So here I am at home and decided to do a Bible study for those that are craving some study in the Word. A little bit about me. I've been ordained almost 25 years. And I think that we have one of the most beautiful churches in Northeastern Ohio at Faith Lutheran in Kent. Love to have you if you'd like to visit. 9 o'clock worship service followed by a wonderful Bible study that is well attended. With that, grace, peace, and mercy to you from God our Father and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Our study for this morning is going to come from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a book that is very, very important. Let me give a little bit of background into the book of Isaiah. First of all, he is an 8th century prophet, 8th century BC, before the captivity into Babylon and also the destruction of the northern 10 tribes of Israel. So he's an important prophet from that standpoint. He is considered one of the 3 great prophets, along with Moses, Elijah, and then, of course, Isaiah. He's actually considered the greatest prophet who used the written word to his advantage. That's another important aspect of him. In modern historical times, Isaiah shows up again and again. First of all, 200 and some years ago, almost 300 years ago, for Handel's Messiah, the words of Isaiah were used by a clergyman and given to Handel to put together to music. 24 days later, Handel was so inspired by the written text of Isaiah that he put together one of the most beautiful symphonies ever. And in fact, it was so dramatic that the clergyman who wrote the words for Handel's Messiah couldn't believe that he had accomplished it in 24 days. So from that standpoint, it's a very inspirational book inside the Christian culture. Also, under the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the 1940s, the great gem that came out of that discovery was almost a complete version of Isaiah. And in fact, today, if you go to Israel, you can see it displayed. It was so dramatic because there were so few errors from the modern text to the ancient text because the Jews were so diligent in making sure that they copied their manuscripts almost word for word. Also, for those who understand how the Jews worship, the Jews use the Torah as their lectionary. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they are working through those 5 books every year. But there's also a secondary reading that will show up. It's known as the Haftorah. And 70% of the second reading that is read during a Jewish service is from Isaiah. So Jesus would have been intimately aware of this book. And in fact, Jesus' first sermon that he ever gives comes from Isaiah 61, where he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. So that would have been a part of the lectionary that was used as Jesus came up to read that. Let me say one thing about Lutherans. We are a people who use a lectionary. I know many modern churches don't. It's more of the opinion of the pastor, what he thinks he needs to preach on. But as a liturgical Lutheran, as a liturgical Protestant, a liturgical Christian, I really have come to appreciate the importance of a lectionary because it requires that the pastor do several things. Number one, he's going to preach on texts that are a little bit more challenging throughout the year. Number two, those who come to church on a regular basis are going to hear major chunks of the scriptures read publicly in the worship service. And finally, number 3, if you're attending service on a regular basis in a liturgical church, you become more aware of the complete Bible as a whole, not just simply one book along the way. So Isaiah has a lot of modern context to it. It has some going back 250 to 300 years with Handel's Messiah. And of course, Jesus used it for his own first sermon. And Paul quotes the book of Isaiah more than any other book of the Old Testament. So it's very, very important to have a working knowledge of the book of Isaiah before you really dive into the New Testament. Now, a couple things about Isaiah also that I want to comment on. Some have called it the Bible in miniature. Others have even called it the fifth gospel. And let me give you a reason for that. Number one is it's got 66 chapters. I don't think that's by accident. I think that's by design. Just as there's 66 books inside the Bible, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. 39 of the Old Testament, the first 39 chapters in the book of Isaiah is what we would label as more law. And then another 27 that comes after that will be more gospel. So the pattern for the chapters in the book of Isaiah is directly in proportion to the 66 books inside the Bible, 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New Testament. With that sort of set up, let's do a little bit of study on Isaiah and get a better working knowledge of it. Let's talk a little bit about the man, Isaiah. Isaiah, of course, is a prophet. He is a person who used the written word very much to his advantage. Isaiah was born of royal blood. He was actually the grandson of one of the kings, and he would have been first cousins to King Uzziah. So basically, when he says, at the death of Uzziah, God called me, that would have been a dramatic personal event that would have taken place in Isaiah's life, to lose his first cousin. So with the death of his first cousin, the king, he receives a calling, the prophetic calling to go into the ministry. A little more background so that we're aware of the different roles of ministry. There's two main roles of ministers throughout the scriptures. Number one is that of the prophet. This one is that of the priest. And then a third one is that of the king. The prophet is the one who speaks on behalf for God to the people. The priest speaks on behalf of the people to God. One is the prosecutor. The other is the defender. Of all of the callings, which one would you rather have? Of course, you want to be the priest. I mean, who doesn't want to defend the people to God? That's the better role to be in. But the role of the prophet is oftentimes very difficult because you have the challenge of trying to, shall I say, sober up the alcoholics that are still at the bar. You're trying to sober up the sinners who are still in love with their sin. And so here you are with that challenge. Now, how do you usually sober somebody up? Well, the bar has to close. And what will happen in Isaiah's ministry is he'll have a 40-year ministry where people just don't listen to him. They reject him. They reject his message. There is old, Isaiah again, doom and gloomer. Why would we want to change when everything is going our way? But when the bar closes, then people sober up. When the enemy is at the gate of Jerusalem, which they will be, people have a tendency to listen. So a very challenging ministry for him, a 40-year ministry that's very personally painful and difficult. So he did not have an easy ministry by any means. And again, with the death of his first cousin, King Uzziah, here is a man who went through personal loss and then goes into the ministry. Now, I want to share this connection, and this is really where I want to go this morning in this study, and that is, I see a lot of connections between Isaiah and the Apostle Paul. Let me use some contemporaries here. Isaiah in chapter 6 he's going to have his calling, and basically he's going to be overcome with the holiness of God. And he will feel that the one thing that he struggles with is unclean speech. And so God will burn his mouth, cauterize to some degree his lips to purify them. That will be part of his initial calling into the ministry. The Apostle Paul also will have a similar event where Isaiah was overcome by the holiness of God. Paul will be overcome by the Holy One of God, who will be the risen Jesus Christ. And instead of his lips being unclean, Paul will have his eyes burnt. Now, why would that take place? I am a firm believer that the Apostle Paul was an eyewitness to the crucifixion of Jesus. We know for a fact that he was a student of Gamaliel. We know for a fact that Gamaliel was on the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. We know for a fact that the Sanhedrin met to make the condemnation against Jesus. And Paul, being a student of Gamaliel, the greatest rabbi in his generation, would have been intimately familiar with the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. I also believe that Paul was one of those Pharisees who was probably standing, seeing the Holy One of God being crucified for the sins of the world, and probably said or snickered and said, he could save others, but he can't save himself. Paul was no fan of Christians at all until his own personal conversion on the road to Damascus to actually persecute and bring Christians back to trial to be executed. And so when he goes through his calling into the ministry, it's very, very similar. More connections between Isaiah and Paul. We know that Isaiah grew up as a man of education. We know that Isaiah grew up as a man of wealth and prestige. Paul also grew up with great education. We know Paul grew up with wealth. And we know Paul was a person of prestige as he was working his way through his own contemporaries by his own admission in some of his letters inside the New Testament. So I see lots and lots of connections between Isaiah and the Apostle Paul. Lots of connections between this holiness concept that takes place between the scriptures here. So as you're studying Paul, you need to keep Isaiah in the back of your mind. As one person said it this way, he said, the Old Testament is the roots for everything in the New Testament. The more you understand about the Old Testament, the more you will understand about the New Testament. My text for today is going to come from basically Isaiah chapter 6, and I really want to get into the calling of Isaiah and really drill down into this concept of holiness. And so we're in Isaiah chapter 6, starting with the first verse, and it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, his first cousin, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on the throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another. And here's what it says, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. And at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. And he said, woe to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I, a man of unclean lips. Very interesting that he says that. I live among the people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the Lord and the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken from the tongs of the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go? Notice this, for us, plural. And I said, here am I, send me. He said, go and tell this people, be ever hearing, but never understanding. Jesus will quote these scriptures too, by the way, when he talks about why he taught in parables. Be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Make their heart of this people calloused. Make their eyes dull, and make their ears dull, and close their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Then I said, for how long, Lord? Great question. How long do you want me to do this? And he says, until the cities lay ruined and without inhabitant, until the houses are left deserted and the fields ruined and ravaged, until the Lord has sent everyone far away, meaning the northern tribes being taken away, and the land is utterly forsaken. And though a tenth remains in the land, that remnant concept, that 10th concept, very important, it will again be laid waste. So basically what is taking place here is Isaiah is receiving his calling. And basically, the first thing that has to happen for Isaiah is that he has to become clean. He has to go from being unclean to clean. He also has to go being from common to holy, being set apart for God's purpose in life. He has to go through his personal Good Friday to get to Easter Sunday. Oftentimes, people who do the most in ministry are the people who have gone through the most dramatic experiences in life. You can't really appreciate something until you've had your hardships. You can't really understand resurrection until you understand crucifixion. You can't really understand how Jesus is raised from the dead until you understand the cross. That's going to happen with Isaiah. That's going to happen with Paul. And that oftentimes has to happen with ministers as well. I think ministers need to experience life. There's nothing wrong with going through challenges in life. It makes you rely more upon the Lord. Now, in Isaiah's case, he needs to have his lips taken care of. In Paul's case, he has to have his eyes worked on. Sometimes God has to do some internal work and even some external work to get people ready for the ministry. Ministry is not just simply, how much Greek you know, or how much Hebrew you know, or what schools you graduated from. Sometimes you have to go through the school of life to really be able to effectively minister to other people. Let me talk a little bit more about Isaiah, if that's okay, this morning. He is listed among the three great prophets, Moses, Elijah, and Isaiah. He was a prophetic writer. When kings who didn't like his message said, don't speak anymore, he just changed his focus and he went to writing. His wife is actually a prophetess herself in her own right. We have no writings from her, but very interesting that it's a ministry family. We know that he had at least two sons, possibly three. The first son's name literally means haste the booty and speed the spoil, talking about the destruction of Israel. The second son, though, is a remnant will return. There's that law gospel concept, not only in the names of his children, but also in his ministry. Isaiah is a law gospel prophet. 39 chapters of law, 27 of gospel, and he does a great job of pivoting and shifting into using terms that don't show up too often in other places. Things like, all things will be new. Isaiah's big about the newness that will come in with the remnant returning from Israel. But again, they got to go through the Good Friday to get to the Easter Sunday. Some have speculated they had a third child, this one called Emmanuel, God is with us. Whether it was his child or somebody else's child, it was a prophecy as part of it. Again, that shows up in the Christmas story concerning Jesus. One of my favorite things about Isaiah is a guy who uses this term almost exclusively. And again, that is, he's always talking about holiness. And people connect the concept of holiness to the Holy One of God, who was Jesus. That's a powerful connection. When we see Jesus, we see the holiness of God being lived out in earthly form. That's dramatic. When we see Jesus, when we see the cross and resurrection, we see the holiness of God taking place. We understand that on the backside of difficulties is resurrection. On the backside of challenges is restoration. Isaiah would have known that very, very well indeed. Let me just touch two things before I kind of finish up here, and that is Jesus quotes Isaiah of why he taught in parables. Probably the best way to contemporarily say it is you got to hide the peas in the mashed potatoes so that people don't reject them. Jesus taught in parables to catch people's attention so that they wouldn't automatically reject what he was saying. By framing it up in story form, basically he got people to continue to think about what he said after he had said it, in a very effective way to teach even today. Story is, by the way, the oldest form of teaching there is. Let me kind of also talk here about this 10th concept or the remnant concept. 10%. being set aside for God, a tenth. Sometimes that's the tithe, but I think a better concept, it is the remnant. When you set aside a certain percentage for God, what it does is it makes you appreciate the rest of what you have, which is really expendable to be used in the world. A certain amount of what we take in should be set aside for the ministry, and so that we appreciate the rest of it, and so that we are able to go forward. I just kind of close with 3 takeaways. I'm an old military guy, so I'm always talking about 3 takeaways for this brief study. Number 1, and I've said it repeatedly, and it's kind of one of my catchphrases, you got to go through Good Friday to understand Easter Sunday. Isaiah understood that personally. He writes that way, and that's part of his prophecy and the way that the book of Isaiah is framed up. Number 2, you can't minister until you personally see the Holy One of God, and that is Jesus. The more you understand about Jesus, the more you understand about the holiness of God, the more you're able to minister to other people, for Jesus is the reason why Christianity exists and Christians do what they do. And finally, number 3, we begin our giving with a remnant so that everything else that follows is appreciated and, quite honestly, expendable. Because God gives things to us so that we can use it to His glory and put it into His ministry. So with that, a brief introduction to the book of Isaiah. I hope this was beneficial. If you want to come and be a part of our worship service at Faith Lutheran in Kent, Ohio, we worship at 9 o'clock, 10:15, 10:20. We have coffee, and then we have a well-attended Bible study afterwards. And with that, God's blessing. And during this COVID-19 quarantine, please continue to stay safe, keep your social distance, wear your mask, and I hope to see everybody soon. And God's blessings. Thank you.